You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
2.5 years ago, I got this option to move to Nigeria to build Pulse Sports basically from scratch, to build a sports media company. We've kind of hit a plateau of a few million users. We're ahead of a lot of our established competitors, but I think further growth is hard and slow. I think talent and recruiting is, for us and for every business that we've worked with, is the number one challenge. 90% of my work is just revolving around either managing the ones we already have or training them. The transformative effect, both good and bad, on the industry is going to make a lot of those people redundant, and for those that don't adapt, it could be quite painful.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have a very special guest. We have James Torvaney, who is the managing director of Pulse Sports and built Pulse Sports from scratch to over 2 million monthly users. They are now the market leaders in online sports news in Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda. Welcome to the podcast, James. How are you?
Thank you very much, Tessa. I'm good, thanks. I'm great. Just arrived in Lagos yesterday, so enjoying the heat compared to London.
Fantastic. Lagos, my spiritual home. How is Lagos at the moment, apart from that humidity?
Yeah, it's hot and humid. I think it's noticeable since I was last here in December, actually, how much the prices have increased. I think, the general inflation globally, but also with the deflation of the Naira, it's quite a significant operational challenge. And, in 3 years, it's gone from around 500 to it's over 1,500 Naira to the dollar. So maybe not the most optimistic point to start off on, but these are some of the challenges that we do have to deal with working in Nigeria.
No, it's very true. Challenging times in Nigeria and globally at the moment, and I'm sure it impacts the work that each and every one of us does, and I guess it might make part of the discussion for today. But no, thank you for sharing that with us, James. What I do at the beginning of each interview is to get the guests to introduce themselves. So introduce yourself and tell us about James Torvaney.
Thanks, Tessa. So, I think you gave me quite a grand introduction. I don't tend to like to big myself up too much. I think I'm just hustling and learning along with everyone else. My name is James Torvaney. I'm managing director at Pulse Sports. My background is actually not in sports at all. It's in finance and accounting. I started out with PwC, moved to West Africa in 2016. And I've worked in really kind of every industry since. I've worked in solar, I've worked in agriculture, poultry farming, logistics, international development, etc. And 2.5 years ago, I got this option to move to Nigeria to build Pulse Sports basically from scratch, to build a sports media company. I've always wanted to come to Nigeria since I was a teenager to live here. So I just kind of jumped at that chance and threw myself headfirst into sports and sports media. And since then, we've launched in Nigeria, we launched in Kenya and Uganda as well. There is a wider Pulse group, which is also present in other countries. And so we've built that. And in all three of those countries, we are, at least in terms of page views and social media following, the largest sports news and entertainment publishers, indigenous sports news entertainment publishers in those countries. So excluding kind of international outlets like BBC. And that's where we are at the moment.
Fantastic. So you mentioned you have a background in finance, worked in a range of industries. Can we go into a bit more detail in terms of how did you come about joining Pulse Sports? I'm assuming you don't have a media background. How did that opportunity come about, and why did you think it was the right opportunity and potentially the right time?
So I think from my point of view, and I often make quite impulsive decisions, so I wouldn't necessarily encourage anyone to follow my decision-making processes, but I just really wanted to come to Nigeria. I think since I was around 16, 17, when I was an aspiring musician, I really got into everything West African. I think starting with the music, I used to listen to a lot of Fela Kuti as well as soukous and high life music. So I got into that. I used to hang out with a lot of, not specifically Nigerians, but a lot of Francophone. I used to hang out predominantly with the Francophone African community in Middlesbrough, which is where I was going to school. And so there were a few Congolese, Ivorians, and I would go out, go to their parties and dance soukous. It's this
amazing
17-year-old white boy who had no real connections to those cultures. And I just loved it, to be honest. And I thought it was a very refreshing change from the predominant culture that I was exposed to. I think in Northern England, around at the time, most of my friends were, playing football, going down the pub and, drinking beers and getting blackout drunk. And that just didn't appeal to me. The music and the dance did, and the, colorful outfits and everything. And this was before Davido became a thing. So that was kind of the seed that was planted. And then I think when I finished my chartered accountancy qualification, I was a bit of a loss. I just thought it was such, I was so understimulated and I wanted something completely different. So got in touch with some agencies that I got in Sierra Leone and I thought, hey, that sounds like fun. I Googled it and I saw it has beaches and rainforests. I thought that sounds like an adventure. So I went there for 3 months. It was very like kind of Pan-African, pro-African, like quite, I would say like naive, green mindset. And it was super difficult at first. Ended up after that 3-month contract, I picked up bits of work. I started up business, ended up staying there for more or less 5 years. Sometimes I wonder how, but I did. And in a few other places around Africa for short periods as well. And then I think I got approached, not directly for this job. Someone actually asked me for help, like, do I know anyone who would be interested in also hiring a number of roles? And I was like, well, actually, I would be interested. Because I was working in recruitment at the time. And I just said, can I send in my application? And more than anything else, I just wanted to come to Nigeria. I didn't really care what the role was, but it sounded fun. And I had exposure to entertainment and sports. I thought that sounds like fun. My role is more like commercial and strategy. As we have a content team, so it's not really like a media. Didn't need a media background to join it. So that was where I came in. And I think it's something quite important. When in Africa, it's quite different to the job market in the UK, where in the UK, I think people tend to be quite specialist in specific skills. And I think in Africa, like you get a lot of like general management positions, whereas whichever industry you're working in, it's about building connections, building networks, putting out constant fires and overcoming operational challenges. And those are quite industry agnostic. So, if you can manage one business, you can manage another, even if it's in a completely different industry. Yeah.
Fantastic. So you've detailed the journey of how you joined Postboard. You mentioned that the current role is more commercial and strategy. So can you share some of those key strategies you employed to grow Postboard to over 2 million monthly users? I believe it was within 6 months.
Yeah, so I'll explain that. When we first started, we had a really small team. I was very involved in that hiring, and the first 6 months was really just killed it on social media. So we actually bought a few Facebook pages, like fan pages that were managed in Nigeria. We merged them together. So we started off with a few 100,000. And we were just really good at Facebook. We would be posting links on our page. We acquired other groups. We had this network of about 20 people who we used to pay a very small amount to, and they would just basically repost. We just paid them to kind of repost our content in all of their groups. So we had this massive reach where you would see post sports stories being shared in like every Facebook and WhatsApp group in Nigeria. And that worked really well for us. And we got millions of page views a month from that. And at that point, we probably got 70+% of our web traffic directly from Facebook. So that did really well. And we got off the ground very quickly. And I think we were looking at 1.5 to 2 million users. And that was in the first 4 to 6 months. Then a few things happened, like Facebook changed their algorithms over time, as well as other social media platforms, to try and keep users on the platform. So they started making it more difficult for users to see external links. And that absolutely crashed our traffic. Like, it killed a huge amount of that traffic. At the same time, we also switched to a new website, which really hurt us in terms of our SEO and our performance on Google search. So we lost around the turn of last year, so the beginning of 2023, we almost went all the way back down to zero traffic again. And that was really tough. So we hired some new people in, especially with experience in generating organic traffic, so Google search traffic. We put a lot of investment into that in terms of optimizing the website for Google. We relooked at our guidelines, like how do we get that click? So thumbnails, headlines, etc., improving the quality of the articles as well. And those changes over the next few months from there helped us to get back up and eclipse what we've been doing before. So we then went in the next 6 months, we went up to about 2 million users again per month. But this time, 50 to 70% of it was, rather than being from Facebook, it was from Google search and Google Discover. Now, those in the publishing industry will generally know there's kind of a hierarchy of quality. So traffic you're getting from social media tends to be lower traffic. People don't stay on the website as much. They don't read as long. They're probably not as high income or as high engagement or as high intention traffic. So, that Google traffic is a lot better. But the next challenge that I think we could face is that with SGE, which is Google's generative results, if that gets rolled out more widely and the results are very good, I think it's going to really hurt a lot of website search traffic, because people will just see the answer that they're searching for without having to click through to the site. So that's something that's happening. And I think also, social media, people are starting to get their news on the platform now. They're not clicking on links as much. There's all of these things which are really hurting us. A lot of the ad revenues have gone elsewhere, gone to social media as well. You've seen a lot of media companies go bankrupt. So these are the trends that are happening. These are the challenges that are coming up for us. And I think for us and most media companies now, we're looking at, we have this base of organic traffic, but what we really want to get as much of our traffic to be direct traffic and recurring traffic. So that's people coming, not searching for us, but coming to our website because our website is the best. And it's the first place they go to, and that means that really having to invest in quality content, authoritative content, trustworthy content, engaging content. And those days where, BuzzFeed or etc. could get huge amounts of traffic from Facebook or even from Google, like those days, are dying or numbered. And the challenges are very different. Like, it's, tough for a lot of companies. And like I said, this is why we've seen a lot of them in trouble.
Yeah. So you mentioned social media and online activity was key to the growth. So what does this growth and online activity indicate about the appetite and the potential of the sports fan base in Africa?
If anything, the market is smaller than we thought. And we've kind of hit a plateau of a few million users, where we're ahead of a lot of our established competitors. But I think further growth is hard and slow. And from speaking with other outlets, they're also finding the same thing, where there's this kind of plateau of users, which is a lot less than we've forecast when we initially looked at the market sizing. So I think there's a few things to say about the growth and appetite of the sports fan base in Africa. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around this. So first thing is that the news market maybe isn't as big as we thought, in terms of having a dedicated news platform website. I think people are more and more getting their news directly from social media, even if it's more prone to false news or bias, etc. So that's how most people behave. They're getting their news from WhatsApp. Probably WhatsApp, Facebook are the main ones. Twitter is still very niche, but it's there, as well as obviously TikTok is growing, YouTube. So I think there's very much an appetite for those things on social media. How much of an appetite there is on the dedicated, media publishing side is a different question. I think the live score apps is an area that's doing really well. So like LiveScore, SofaScore, FlashScore, they have a very specific use case. They've got products that are really well tailored to how people who want to place bets use these sites, and the information that they want to get in terms of live stats. They're doing very well. They've got a clear market. And I think most of the growth is going away from being growth in like hard news or journalism, and it's more towards fast news, but more importantly, like banter, lifestyle, etc.
Yeah.
Betting tips. Betting is just a huge driver of the sports media market. I think without sports betting, there probably wouldn't be a sports media industry or sports publishing industry in Africa. So those are some of the things. And I think my final point there as well is that we talk a lot in Africa, not just in sports, but in all industries, about this kind of the numbers and the demographics. And we go, oh, well, there's so many people and there's all these young people, and therefore there must be an opportunity, and it's really big. And that is the case. I mean, everyone watches football. You've got almost 1 billion people, football fans on the continent, but actually working out how do you create product, like a distinctive product, and how do you monetize that is a different case, because most people, they want to see the scores, or maybe they want to watch the matches. A lot of those are things that they can get from, live score or from BBC, etc. So in terms of creating an Africa-focused product, there's a lot of work. Like, it's quite difficult to actually find like exactly what is that niche and what is the demand actually for, and how can you make a business out of that.
Thank you for sharing that, James. You touched on a key point in terms of monetizing sports fan bases. Do you think many sports brands, international sports brands, understand how to acquire and monetize their African fan base?
Yeah, so when it comes to international sports brands, I think historically most don't really care how to acquire and monetize the African fan base. It is starting to change. There are a few, NBA being one of the obvious examples, who are becoming more cognizant of the potential of the African consumer market. I think since I've come here, both Puma and Adidas have set up stores in Lagos. Nike, through one of their distribution partners, have also set up a flagship store. And I think all three of those have opened in the last 2 years since I came. So there are signs, although those are still they're very small markets for those brands. The economics are very tough. It's very competitive. A lot of people don't have a lot of disposable income to spend on, Nike merchandise, for example, when you can get a fake one in the market for a fraction of the price. And I think even with the international brands that we are seeing coming in, I think most of them, from my experience, are more concerned about how can we mine Africa's talent and how can we basically get cheap sporting talent, rather than how can we tap into the audience in Africa. Now, there are exceptions, and that is, as I think, changing. And I think it's going to take another 5 to 10 years before we see brands really start to invest in their African fan bases. But I'm not seeing a huge amount, and I'm seeing a lot more like focus on talent first rather than fan. The obvious area, the one that is doing very well, that is monetizing that African fan base, is sports betting, which is, exploding across the continent, but especially in Nigeria.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's a conversation I've had in the past in terms of African sports talent being exported out of the continent, and what are the pros and cons of that in terms of the actual skill level and the infrastructure on the continent, and how do we go forward to potentially develop that area and build our own brands on the continent where we have top level talent playing. So going back to your point in terms of Puma, Adidas, NBA have showed some level of interest in monetizing the African fan base. In your opinion, or in terms of what you see, what role do you believe the digital media solutions play in that process?
I mean, obviously, I think digital media plays a huge role in acquiring customers, especially kind of young audiences. And this varies massively from country to country as to, in terms of digital penetration rates, etc. I think that there is an important caveat that I think more so than in other parts of the world, I think trust and physical presence are more important in most of our markets. I think trying to build a digital-only brand can be very difficult, because there's, depending on the market, that there can be a lack of trust. If we take betting as an example, there's constantly new brands come, or tech, fintech, there's constantly new brands coming in and then leaving because they don't have funding or they didn't make a profit. And I think people can be very wary, but if you have, a real physical investment, if you're investing in CSR, if you have billboards, if you have physical offices, that stuff is actually important for establishing trust. And I think there's a lot of old school methods here. For example, print, billboards, SMS marketing, TV ads, radio, that are still very strong and often underestimated by international and digital brands.
Yeah, so you touched on trust and physical appearance being important elements in terms of building brands on the continent. So what challenges did you face in setting up the digital media platform in terms of Pulse Media?
That's a good question. I think any business that you start in Africa, and anyone who's operated here knows that there's this whole bundle of things that we just put under like operational difficulties. Whether it's traffic or electricity or just somehow, no matter how hard you try, there always seems to be operational challenges, and it's even hard sometimes to think about specifically what it is, but they're there. I think talent and recruiting is, for us and for every business that we've worked with, I think is the number one challenge. Like if 80-90% of my work is just revolving around people, like either managing the ones we already have or, and training them, or bringing in new people, and finding the right people. So I think with us specifically, what we wanted to do and what we're trying to do is to engage like a new generation of sports fans. I think when we look at the traditional ways of doing things, publishing in particular, media in particular in Nigeria and Africa is very traditional. So, we get people they've worked at a radio station or TV station for 10 years, and they have ideas of how things should work based on their training at university 15 years ago, or maybe more. And that's like very, very different to what we're trying to do, which is kind of next generation media, which revolves around short form video. So I think that mindset is really difficult to find people who are, young enough to really grasp that and grasp how this new world of social media works. At the same time, who also have the technical skills. And, a lot of people aren't on like LinkedIn, for example. So you're actually cutting through the noise and finding those people can often be very difficult.
Thank you for sharing that. So you touched on the day-to-day operational challenges, which you do see in a large number of African markets or countries, and also talent and recruiting have been some of the main challenges. I guess with overcoming those challenges, potentially or hopefully comes growth. So with that growth, what are some of the key milestones that you've seen during would I call it recent emergence or evolution of African-focused sports media?
I think in terms of the changes in the industry, I've mentioned about some of these before, I've touched upon them. I think in the past, publishers tended to be very, and still are, kind of family dominated and very political. So, you have these big newspapers that are, owned by a family that has various business interests, and it is just part, and it may not even be a particularly profitable part of their overall empire. And, they'll often be quite, aligned with one party or the other. And, they rely a lot for, election cycles for their advertising revenue, et cetera, et cetera. And, and the quality was quite low, but again, it didn't particularly need to be high. And a lot of money coming in from betting companies, which is fueling the media industry. So I think you still have a lot of these kind of political giants, and anyone in any of these markets will know who they are in those markets. I think social media has massively changed that. So people, especially younger people, they're going away from brands and more towards like individual content creators. There's some great solo creators, in the African sports media space. Some of whom are very, you've got betting tipsters, you've got journalists, videographers, or TikTok people, or ex-Big Brother stars who are coming and doing sports content. So I think there's that shift away from brands onto individuals, the shift away from written and onto visual and specifically short form video. So I think those are big changes. I think the next one that we're looking at is around AI as well. I think that's going to be massively disruptive. And I still think a lot of people are in denial about the transformative effect, both good and bad, on the industry. I think it's going to make a lot of these traditional houses and writers who are still kind of stuck in this old model, is going to make a lot of those people redundant. And for those that don't adapt, it could be quite painful, both for the companies and the individuals. And then I think the obvious milestone that we've seen recently is, the AFCON, which was a massive success. And I have to admit, I, ate my words a bit with that. And I think that success came out because of what I was talking about. It came out because their digital team was on point. CAF have now 8 million TikTok followers, which I think is up for about 5 million before the tournament. They were really good with that. They know how to engage their young audience, and they've done that. And I think they also kind of rode this wave of global interest in Africa, in African culture, Amapiano, Afro beats. And they did that really well and showed how we could take an African sporting event and make it like pop globally on digital. And I don't think too many other people have done that. I think that I want us to be able to do that with both sports. And I think that savvy players will do that, and they will link African sports into, African lifestyle, music, fashion, etc. Because that stuff is becoming increasingly cool now. Like, it's becoming kind of mainstream, or at least in vogue, with a young audience in the UK and America. Now, if we can kind of, as sports, like join that conversation and go international, I think that's another trend that I see.
So you've given a great example there in terms of how we can link African sports to African lifestyle and culture to reach a wider and bigger audience. So I guess from the growth we've seen recently, as you mentioned, in terms of the African Cup of Nations, are you surprised by what African sports media has achieved so far?
I can't say that I'm surprised so far. With the exception of AFCON, I wouldn't say I'm surprised by the achievement so far, because I think as an industry, we have underachieved. I don't think African sports media as an industry is fulfilling its potential. I think in many ways we are still stuck in the past and still kind of clinging to old models and desperately hoping that they work. So no, I wouldn't say I'm surprised, because I think there's so much that's being left on the table and not being achieved that could have been or could be in the future.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that, James. So you mentioned in terms of you feel there's a lot that's being left on the table and not being achieved. But I guess in a general term, you've discussed about the acquisition of 10 million monthly users. If we fully utilize the potential in terms of how the space operates, how big do you believe the space can grow to in terms of what you're doing with Post Sports?
The space being sports media?
Yes.
I think if you look at what we're doing in a broad sense in terms of consuming sports content, there's obviously just so much bigger a market than any particular. If you look at, say, Supersport on DSTV, I think they have something like 23 million subscribers across Africa, mostly in South Africa and Nigeria. Now, they're the biggest. I think Star Times, I think, has around 12, maybe Canal Plus 8 million or so. But, even if you add those up, you're looking at a continent of well over 1 billion people now, the majority of whom watch sport and follow international sport, at least. Maybe not their own leagues, but they follow international sport and they follow their countries. So that, that's an audience of hundreds of millions of people. And now we're saying that, all of the pay TV platforms combined only have a few tens of millions. The same thing if we look at what we're doing in publishing. If we have, around, say, 3 million monthly users, and, some of the bigger ones across the continent may have more, maybe in the tens, in the low tens. Again, it's still just a fraction of what it could be. I think, social media is probably our strongest suit, where, we have maybe 5 or 6 million followers across our different platforms. But again, you're talking about a market size that's, in the hundreds of millions of people. It's a 9-figure space. And admittedly, not everyone in Africa is online, but they're increasingly coming online. And for those that do, what are the things that they want to search for? If you look at most search terms in Nigeria or any African country on Google, you'll find like sports and sports betting dominate those top searches. So the answer, I think, is just much bigger than any one brand is claiming at the moment. How big that is, who knows? But you're talking like 100 million people plus that the user would be interested in this kind of content.
So if we move from the African sports media and look at African sports brands, from your perspective, how do you believe African sports brands can utilize sports media to promote their brands globally outside of the continent?
I think it's a good question because I think there's definitely an opportunity to kind of ride the global wave of popularity of African culture. And I still think as much as the African consumer market is huge in terms of number of people, it's really tough, really expensive to get penetration, and the individual buying power is low. So it's the African consumer market, I think, is still a very long-term play, and it's a difficult one. So I think your question about how do we do it to promote our brands globally is a good one. I think ways that they can do it, there's a few things. So one, like I say, is jumping on top of this, trend in music, lifestyle, etc. So that may be cross collaborations. We've seen a lot in the US particularly. NBA is very good at this. They've had Burna Boy and Thames at the All-Star weekend. In football, you've had it was Burna Boy at the UCL final, Davido at the World Cup. So there's a lot of like opportunity for crossover there. We've seen Arsenal do a fair bit with Odumodu and Declan Rice, for example. And there was another, but I can't remember who it was. But there's a lot of these kind of music tie-ups, fashion tie-ups as well. I haven't seen that being exploited as much as it could, but it can be. In terms of kit mashups, etc. In terms of more lifestyle-oriented content, about not so much about what are the players doing on the pitch, but what are their lifestyles like? Like, what are their fashion tastes? Who are they dating? What food do they like to eat? Like, those kind of things are really popular. There's a lot of content that we can do around those that I think it can kind of propel us internationally.
Yeah, fantastic. Very interesting and very valid points. What role do you think the African diaspora can play in this?
Yeah, I think the recent AFCON and the success of that can offer a template for how the diaspora can help sports on the continent. I think some of it is as simple as just hyping it up. Nigerians in particular, and the diaspora, I think, are very prominent on social media. Niger Twitter is a thing. Yeah. And so as we saw during AFCON, it was, I've got a lot of friends in the Nigerian community in London, but it's like everybody kind of came out and showed up both online and physically, like at watch parties. And that makes a big impression because if, everyone in the diaspora, you have, I think, by various estimates, between 1.5 and 2.5 million African diaspora in the UK alone. I think is around 400,000 Nigerians in the UK, first or second generation. Now, if everyone there is tweeting about it or telling their friends or, going to events and, supporting their team, that is a very powerful group of people. So if they're all lobbying for a certain, for teams or brands of Africa in general, that could really have like a game-changing difference. I think that for me is like the big one. I think sharing on social, etc., all of that stuff. We could probably talk about, remittances and investing back into the economy in the African countries. I mean, that's also a factor, but it's not. I think it will come if we can create good business propositions, good investment propositions that will do it. I don't want people to be investing back in just because it's charity. So I think the onus is on those of us working on the continent to create good things that they can invest in.
Interesting. From your experience, are you seeing any African sports brands that are potentially using this as a strategy in terms of engaging with the diaspora to grow their brands globally or outside of the continent?
It's a good question. I think there's a few sportswear brands that are doing this. And so I think this guy at Afra Sports, who do a lot of they call it Afra Leisure. So it's like athleisure, equipment, tracksuits, trainers, etc. They're manufactured in Nigeria, and they've kind of tapped into this Afro vibe. I really like their stuff. I have some. It's kind of like Nigerian traditional wear, but done in a sporty way with sporty materials. They, I think, have recently opened up a store in Houston. So, they kind of started in Nigeria and they're going abroad. In East Africa, you have Enda Sportswear, which is a Kenyan company that manufactures running shoes, who were acquired earlier this month by NVH. So I think there are a lot of examples there in the sportswear space of companies that are growing and being acquired. I think there's a few founded by Africans in Europe, for example, like Daily Paper, Labram, Ashlux, who I think are actually based in Nigeria, doing a lot of cool African-inspired sportswear. And so these are the ones I like that are kind of mixing sportswear and urban culture or music culture or lifestyle culture. And they're starting within those kind of diaspora audiences and growing out. I think one I use a lot as well is, that I really like what they're doing is Sporting Lagos. So they were, started by Shola at Paystack and a few others within the tech space, and they've disrupted that very traditional industry of running sports clubs with a very different mindset. And they've grown a lot quicker than I think I expected them to be honest. They've done very well. They've built up a really core fan base of young, digitally literate people. They've established a really good digital brand. And I think, again, what they're doing is they're more than really just a sports club. They're actually building a community. So I think they plan to open a new stadium and members club on the beach. So it's like a beach club where you can also watch their football games. And I really like that because, again, they're leaning into saying, it's not just about same old sports thing. Let's introduce a sense of community. Let's introduce a digital brand. They've released a series of comic books as well. And they've got a big following in the diaspora, which I'm sure at some point they will start monetizing more. So these are some of the brands that I think are doing some interesting things. And I'm sure there are plenty more examples that I could come up with.
No, that's brilliant. So you've given a great example of Sporting Lagos and how they've used digital trends to grow their community and brand. So keeping on the theme of trends, what trends in Africa's sports media space are you currently seeing that you're excited about?
In terms of trends, I think I've mentioned a lot of the ones before in terms of the growing predominance of video, the globalization and the increasing importance of the diaspora in driving the global popularity and crossovers between lifestyle and sports. I think that excites me because I'm not coming at this from a hardcore sports fan background. I'm not reading every stat, watching every game in full. I'm kind of like a casual sports fan who was originally a music fan and now watches bits of sports here and there. So those, I think, are the big trends. And then I also mentioned AI as well, which I think it's maybe a bit overhyped, but it is going to have a big impact. I think the final one, the big thing that I see, and I think this is probably still 5 to 10 years away from really, really gathering up steam, but I'm definitely starting to see a lot more interest in global players. I've had global sports publications reaching out to me that normally never cover Africa. We've seen Nike, Adidas, Puma, On Running launch to various extents. We've seen NBA come in. We've seen NFL making some big plays now. La Liga have multiple offices on the continent. So there is this sense that brands are looking, and I think they're first coming for talent, but they are also looking to activate that fan base. And it just feels the last year has been picking up steam.
Thank you for sharing that. So moving past trends and looking at the future of Africa, how do you see the digital sports media space evolving over the next 5 years on the continent?
I think in sports generally, as well as more specifically sports media, I reckon probably 5 to 10 years from now, with economic development and also maxing out of other markets, i.e., Europe and Asia, I think 5 to 10 years is when we'll really start seeing these brands look to Africa and saying, hey, we need an Africa strategy. We need an African audience, because they're pursuing growth. Right now, they're still getting growth in Western markets, but it's slowing down. And I think they are going to come to Africa looking for more growth. So, and at that point, I think a lot of them, rather than because it's a difficult business environment, rather than building things up from scratch, a lot of them will want to come and acquire companies that are already doing things well here. So I think whether it's in media or whether it's in sports more general, the strategy and the opportunity now is like work this stuff out, build out audiences, communities, and brands, that work here on a lean budget. And in a few years' time, there's probably going to be an influx of capital. There'll probably also be a lot of M&A activity. When these big companies, your IMGs, your Premier Leagues, etc., we want to make a bigger push for that African audience. So I think that's the play. And in terms of evolving, again, I've mentioned the trends around AI, short form video. Those will only continue. I think the video one in particular, I think we're going to see a massive improvement and proliferation of sports short form video content in Africa. There's not a huge amount at the moment. It's not huge quality. I think we'll start seeing a lot of diaspora getting into that space and raising the game for everyone else. And we saw a little hint of that at the AFCON.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's some very insightful pieces of information there. Some pieces that I've not really considered, but now that you've mentioned it, makes perfect sense. Where do you see yourself? What work will you be doing in 5 years' time in terms of contributing to African sports media?
In a personal capacity, I have a couple of things that I am working on or will be working on over the next few years. I can't give too many details right now on all of them. I think one is in terms of strengthening the information available to senior business leaders. So I think there's a kind of lack of information. There's a lot of opacity around the market. So it's quite hard for those looking to get into the market to really access it or to know how to operate. So I would like to work with those. I will be working with some of those international brands to help them come into the market. There's something we do with Pulse. We have worked with a number of these brands, on their PR, comms, digital marketing, etc. So that's where I see myself working. I think there's also, there's more on the content plays in terms of lifestyle, sports lifestyle, which I can't divulge too much detail on. I think the final point, like longer term, is what I would really love to be able to do is to be able to bring together, investors and operators on the ground to launch some kind of fund or investment vehicle for sports in Africa specifically. I think that's a few years away from me being able to pull together the necessary funds, etc. But we've already seen, I think, the first African sports fund. We've seen some capital deployed. So I would love to be part of in the future.
Very exciting stuff. Hopefully I'll get to hear more about that in the near future.
Well, I hope so as well.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today, James?
It's not a quote per se, but I say don't overthink things. Maybe don't take things too seriously. Sometimes just have patience and see how things play out. Sometimes we can overthink these things and overstress these things or oversweat the small stuff.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, James. We've come to the end of today's conversation. Do you have any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in African sports, sports media, the stuff that you do in Pulse Sports?
I think we've covered everything there. We've covered trends. We've covered history. Interest in connecting. Please hit me up, send me a DM. LinkedIn is the best place to do that. If you have a brand that's interested in entering the market or, you just want to talk about your digital strategy again, send me a message. These are all things that we do with Pulse Sports. We don't just have the website. We also have, a full service digital marketing agency. We've worked with brands like Nike, NBA, NFL. So do just get in touch, send me a DM and I'm happy to talk to anyone and everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, James. What a great way to close today's conversation. Thank you for sharing your experience of navigating the complexities or challenges, but also the opportunities of the African sports media space. It's been an absolute pleasure and an insightful conversation. And looking forward to hearing more in terms of how the space develops and the work that you'll be doing through Post Sports.
Great. Thank you very much, Tessa.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.